Hey everyone, it's Sean from Crafted Elements, and in this video we're going to be looking at our blank line of router bases. Essentially router bases that will work with any router because they don't have pre-drilled holes, they are blank. And there's a special way to kind of line these up and drill them and measure them. So I want to demonstrate that here in case you're purchasing one of our router bases and you want to know how to do it without messing it up. We actually have a series of router bases in a bunch of different formats. We've got a router table plate, we've got a 6-inch round, we've even got these two-handled, ergonomically pleasing bases that you can mount a trim router to. But we've actually got these series of router bases with pre-drilled holes for certain router brands. So before you go and buy one of these universal blank ones that we have, go check out our website at craftedelements.com and look for one that actually is pre-drilled for your router, so you can skip this entire process of having to measure and drill and stuff. The blank router bases are specifically for routers that are more obscure, maybe off-brand, maybe imported, or maybe they're just older routers. You've got that old like 20-year-old router in your shop and you don't want to give it up. Cool. You can use one of these router bases if it doesn't match up with the current router base mounting holes. So the first thing I want to note about our blank router bases is they don't have the router mounting holes, but they all have these linear channels, so to say. Okay, so you've got your router hole for your router bit, which is going to come through here, your collet and your router bit, and then you've got a horizontal channel on center, and that applies to any of these blank router bases. But you'll notice that most routers have 4 holes. So we've actually put these channels with recesses in here to kind of cover most cases where you can get 2 holes of most routers. And I say most routers because these channels are in line, right? They are straight, dead center, right across the plane there. If you have a router where the mounting holes are not linear in line with your router collet, the center of the actual router shaft, then you're not going to use these anyway. You're going to drill 4, 3, or however many holes your router has. To really drive that home, I just want to demonstrate here. So I've got a DeWalt router. Now, by the way, you wouldn't use one of these for a DeWalt router because you've got a DeWalt router plate that matches this router and a bunch of other DeWalt routers. But let's say you didn't. Let's say we didn't have a plate and you wanted to mount this router to a blank plate. When you line it up here, and I can kind of line it up like this, you can see that the line, or the virtual line, goes between the channel, the 2 channels, and through the center of the router bit. So you're going to have the ability to mount this nice and centered. Whereas something a little bit more obscure, like this is a ThinkWork Amazon imported router. Kind of looks centered when you look at it, but if I took a ruler and marked between, you would see that the router collet, the center of the router shaft, is definitely not in line with those screws. So what happens is if you try to mount this to this with these channels, yeah, you could mount it, but your center of your actual router base, or your actual router shaft, or the collet, is not going to be centered in the hole. If you are wanting to use bushings, like this guy, like the old quarter cable style bushings, which is very, very common to use with these, all of our handheld router bases have them. So fits that, fits that, fits this guy. It just won't be used with this because this is a router table plate for making a router table where you wouldn't use a bushing anyway. You're not going to be able to use a router bushing if your router shaft is off center of this hole. It's not going to go anywhere because it's going to hit the inside of the router shaft. These channels are only good for routers that, again, have those hole mounting holes in line of the router shaft. But to be clear, even if you've got a router that's got offset holes, this will still work. You can still use any of these blank bases. You just have to drill all of the holes. So these recesses that we put in here are really just to save 2 of the 4-part steps. But again, any router will work with these router bases because you can definitely drill your own holes and skip the use of these channels altogether. Now the point of this video is, of course, to just show you how to really do this so you don't mess it up, and to do it as kind of accurately as possible. And this applies to any of our blank router bases, or even our blank router sled bases. So we've got router sleds here at Crafted Elements, and this is the blank base for our router sled. It's thicker than these guys. This is 1/2 inch. These guys are 3/8, but this video will also apply to that and work the exact same way. So a couple of things you're going to want. You're going to want a marking device, pen or marker. You want some painter's tape or masking tape. You're going to want a 1/4 inch router bit like this guy, or a 1/4 inch post, or if you have it, a 1/4 inch centering pin, which is specifically designed, looks like a golf tee, a big brass golf tee, specifically designed for centering your routers on router bases. You're going to need a variety of drill bits to drill out the router base plates. If you have a router bushing with a 1/4 inch hole, then this will definitely help, and it'll save you some time if you've got that. It's easier to line up center when you're using the bushing and you're using one of our plates that feature a hole for a bushing rather than just kind of doing it by hand. And of course, you're going to need a router. You're going to need a way to unscrew the OEM router base from your router and screw the screws to our base back to your router. So the very first thing you need to do is line up the holes and figure out where you're going to drill your holes. Seems obvious, but keeping them center is really important. Every single one of our blank bases has these etched crosshairs. You can see right here, right here. You can see there's crosshairs here. And what that does, it'll actually demonstrate where center is. So I want to just do this two different ways. You can either use the OEM router plate that you've taken off your router. So in this case, this is a DeWalt router plate that came off this DeWalt trim router. I've got a larger full-size router here, a skill router. Here's the router plate. So again, these are the OEM plates that we're going to be replacing. So very first thing is, regardless, is to take your OEM router plate off your router and save those screws. So using our trim router table plate, which of course we've already got one specific for DeWalt, but we're going to pretend that we don't just for the sake of this demonstration. I've got our DeWalt base plate, and these are our mounting holes. So the first thing you're going to want to do is just line this guy up and use a pen or black marker and go through and mark the center of each of these holes. Now, of course, you're going to want to do this in such a way that you've ensured this plate is centered. So you're going to be using the features of your OEM plate as well as the crosshairs here to determine where center is. Now, if you're thinking like, well, that's not exactly accurate, I'm going to show you an example, of course, in a couple of minutes where we're going to get the accuracy up a notch and using our router bushings and centering pin instead. One thing you might want to do in this case is use your masking tape. If you're using a pen or pencil, it's almost impossible to transcribe onto acrylic. If you're using a magic marker, it's usually not an issue. So again, these are my holes. If I line it up like this, I'm going to have to drill 4 new holes at this point, this point, this point, and this point, and I can mark those. But if I want to use 2 of these holes and my existing channels here, I can also do that. I can line up these 2 holes with the channel and then figure out just where the other 2 are going to be. So mark it like that. So I've got these 2 holes lined up in the channel that's already in the router base, and I'm going to go ahead and trace out these 2 here. So in this case, all I need to do to mount this router to this guy is drill these 2 holes out. All right. I'm going to show you how to do that in a second, but I'm just going to skip this and go to one of our other router bases. So let's say you wanted to use one of our larger format router bases, or even this guy, and center it up. And you've got a router bushing. Now the router bushings are really handy. They are a general size, I think it's like 1 3/16, and they sit right in to these router base plates. Now what that allows you to do is go and grab your router and line it up like so, and then use either a centering pin, which is designed for this actual application, lining up routers to router bases, or just like a 1/4 inch post, or even just a straight 1/4 inch bit. All these are going to be perfect to throw into this bushing, into your router, so I know that this is centered. Like I said, I could also just do this with a 1/4 inch router bit as well if I didn't have a centering pin. Now at this point I can see that the center of the router isn't quite perfect in terms of being in line with those mounting screws. You can see it's just off by a little bit, but you could also just drill all 4 holes and not use this channel at all. Easiest way to do it is either going from the back and going into that hole, which is a little tougher, or lining this guy up and then using a magic marker, or a Sharpie I guess, to just mark right from the top as close and as accurate as you can. All right, so now I've got my 4 holes that I'm going to drill out. So now we're going to talk about drilling these guys out. What I recommend is using, again, some painter's tape and applying it so you can still see your marks. Now, I'm using the painter's tape because acrylic's pretty slippery. So if you go and take your drill bit and just drill into it, you'll probably have some bit walk and it'll go sideways on you. You want to start with a small diameter rudder bit. I would say 1/8 inch or less. This is definitely less than 1/8 of an inch. And fairly simply drill out all these holes. And essentially what you're doing is you're drilling a pilot hole, and then you're going to expand the hole using consecutively larger diameter rudder bits or larger diameter drill bits. And we're doing this to avoid cracking the acrylic. If I take a bigger bit right now, it'll probably be okay, but I do run the risk of cracking the acrylic by drilling into it. So when you use a pilot hole method, you can also check to make sure that it's centered, and you don't really have to worry about breaking the acrylic because you're starting with a small hole. I've got my holes made. I'm going to go to a larger diameter bit now. All right, I can remove the tape here, and you'll see those holes are nice and clean. The next thing we're going to do is countersink them, because once you take your screws, we can't use this just like that because the screw is sitting proud of the rudder base. So we need to countersink these screws so they sit lower. So you can pretty much use any countersink for this, but I'd recommend a 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch diameter one, something like this guy. Small enough that it's going to be able to countersink the screws and not make too big of a hole. And you just want to do this really carefully. Not that it's going to break the acrylic, but you don't want to go all through the rudder plate. You want to just get it enough that it's going to allow you to recess the screw and that the screw is going to come through the other side. That would be okay. I could go a little bit deeper. So I'm going to bring my rudder back, and I'm going to line it up again with my bushing and a centering pin or my bit. Voila. We've got our rudder attached to the blank base. We didn't use those channels just because of the way that those screws were aligned. And we've got a nice centered shaft right in the center of that hole that comes in our blank rudder base. Well, that was fun. Let's do it again and use that trim rudder plate. Just going to go ahead and use those channels because most full-size rudders, the mounting holes will be in line with the center of the rudder, the actual shaft in this rudder. And then I really can just pick my poison as to which of these other holes I want to drill into to mount this. So again, I'm not using the bushing in this case. I'm really just using these crosshairs on this base. Take the rudder base off. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a scrap piece of wood to put down on my bench that I can drill through. Unless you want to sacrifice your bench, depends on what your bench is made of, I guess. But you want to be able to drill right through this cleanly. So again, we're going to be starting with our smaller diameter bit to avoid cracking the acrylic. I didn't use any masking tape that time, but of course the bit didn't walk away on me, but I definitely recommend using it if you've got it, because it will save you the hassle if it does happen. And we're going to go to our larger diameter bit once we've got our pilot holes made. And then we're going to countersink this. Now we've got an example where we used the built-in channels to save drilling of 2 of those screw holes. So final takeaways. Crafted Elements is your source for aftermarket rudder bases. We've got trim rudder table bases, we've got wide format bases, and by the way, if you're wondering what these guys are used for, they are really, really handy for using with big templates like tray templates, where you do not want your router to ever go below the template. So problem with some of the smaller bases or the OEM like 3 or 4 inch bases, you can't trim this, you can't pocket this out because your router is going to fall into that template, whereas a giant footprint router base like this, you will never have a problem with it going below the template. So that's what these big guys are for. But if you want a trim router base or a big monster router base like this, a small 6-inch or one of our dual handle, check out craftedelements.com. We've got the router bases pre-drilled for a ton of routers. But if your router is not in that list and you've got an older router or an off-market router or a Chinese import router or whatever, you can definitely get our universal blank router bases. Follow the instructions in this video to drill it yourself. So you can use the OEM base plate to line it up and drill your center marks, or you can actually place the router and the base together and mark it with a magic marker or pencil. It doesn't really matter how you do it, just make sure you're as accurate as possible. And to increase that accuracy, using a router bushing with a 1/4 inch bit or router centering pin for bushings is the best way to do it. Drill a small pilot hole with a small drill bit, work up from there, countersink with a countersink bit, then attach your screws and you're gravy. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it informative enough. Make sure you like and subscribe and follow us here on YouTube, and go over to craftedelements.com and hit that contact button if you've got any specific questions you want answered by email. All right, guys, thanks for watching and happy making.